So the thing I wanted to talk about today, spurred on by some prodding from my trusty editor, is education. Now, education might seem like a very broad topic, and I intend to tackle it in a relatively broad manner. I'm not going into super specifics on certain things, but I think I'll be able to do a detailed enough job that it's useful for most people. So I think the first question you have to ask about education is, why does the standardized schooling system exist as it does right now? What's the need for it, right? Because there used to be a time when education wasn't public. Education was entirely private, and there was no public education system, and only the people who could afford to send their kids to school were able to get education at all. Now that might seem like a perfectly logical system, but realistically that's not possible. Just like how, for example, if vaccines weren't administered basically for free to everyone, not everyone would get them, and it would defeat the whole purpose of having vaccines in the first place. So in order for education to be completely effective, as large a percentage of the population as possible has to be exposed to it. And for that reason, we came up with the public education system, because we could. Think of it like herd immunity against ignorance is what I like to put it as. It's like we all know things, so we don't have to constantly ward off stupid people. Now you could say in the current time, this hasn't been doing a very good job, but I don't think it's education's problem. I think it's a misinformation problem. But I'm not going to get into that right now. So let's talk about the public education system, because that is the fundamental norm that we're dealing with in today's society, right? So what's the problem with the public education system? Well, first of all, there's not enough money, right? And some people might say it's not a money problem. Recently, I saw an interview that Joe Rogan did with a person who wants to be the mayor of New York, who said that it's not a money problem, and that a lot of the reasons that people aren't getting good enough education in underfunded schools is because there's a lot of money being used for the wrong purposes. But fundamentally, this is equivalent to saying we should tax the rich to feed the poor or whatever. Like, at the end of the day, it's still a money problem. It's just money is going here, it's not going there, something like that. At the end of the day, you still need more money, right? And this is mostly a problem in inner city areas or places where the tax income for the school district isn't as high. Maybe because the people who live there don't pay as much property tax, or they don't have as high an income. So the school just has less money to work with overall. Now, this is not a huge problem if the number of people that they have to serve is low. Then it's fine, because they have less money for less people, and that's acceptable. But generally, they have the same number of people, they just have way less money. Now, you've heard this from many other people as well, but people have been saying all over the place that, art programs are getting canceled, and music programs are getting canceled, and after-school programs, which are actually essential for people who want to send their kids to school and not have to pay for daycare. One of the most important things to have in a public school is after-school programs, because schools usually get over at 2:30 or 3, and work doesn't usually end until 5 for most people. So there's like 2.5 hours or 3 hours of wasted time there that they would have to pay someone to take care of their kids for, right? That usually ends up meaning that either the kids drop out of school early because the parents can't afford to pay for that, or the parents have to take off work early to come pick up the kids. That's not a good thing. You can't hold a job if you have to tell your boss, hey, I have to get out at 2 every day to pick up my kids. Your boss is not going to care about that, right? So there's this inherent inequality in the public education system, which we can't really address because it's based off of local tax income. Now, there is some federal funding for schools, and there was a problem with this when George Bush passed the No Child Left Behind Act, I think it's called, where he tied federal money was linked conditionally to standardized tests. Now, everyone's talked about the evil of standardized tests, but no one's really talked about the evil of linking needed funding to standardized tests, which is really the problem. If standardized tests were just the norm and nobody really cared about them, or they had no consequence, then it wouldn't be a big deal, because schools would just go through with them just because they have to, and they wouldn't have to tailor their curriculum to teach to the standardized tests because they're not consequential. The only reason people care about standardized tests at all is because the federal money is linked to the scores that you get on them. And now teachers and students and whole school districts are graded on how good their students pass standardized tests. So that's why the whole lower education system is completely fucked. But that's public education, right? So public education is just fucked, and you get a good or bad education depending on whether you live in a rich or poor area. For example, when I was in grade school, we lived in a place where there was one good school, And the good school was located in a neighborhood which was very expensive, but just across the road from the back of the school was an apartment complex that was right next to a highway, which is traditionally low-income area, right? So to get into this elementary school, my whole family moved to this place specifically to get into this good school because we had researched it and because we weren't rich enough to live right next to it. So we like kind of hacked the system. So it's like a well-known fact that where you live affects how good your schooling will be. And for most people, this means that if you live in a poor area because you are poor, your schooling will be poor and it won't prepare you in the ways that it needs to go to higher education, which we'll talk about later. So that's just public schools. What about the other alternatives, right? What about private schools, charter schools? Now, as far as I can tell, private schools, there's nothing wrong with. You pay private schools from your own pocket, and then you get the education that you pay for. It's a pretty simple system. It's like paying for healthcare directly out of your pocket. You get what you pay for because you're paying for it directly. The government doesn't really have any involvement in this. I think they can't even tell you what to teach in that, because I know there are some Christian private schools that teach creationism and things like that as if they were real. I can't agree or disagree with that. If your parents choose to send their kids there, they should probably look into that, and if that's what they want to teach their kids, then I can't say much against that. That might be too libertarian a stand for some people, but ultimately people's kids are their kids, and I don't like excessively big government to some extent. So if people want to send their kids to a place that teaches creationism, then I don't know how you fix that. I think that's just something you have to deal with. But my problem specifically is with charter schools. Now, charter schools I wouldn't have a problem with if they just operated like private schools, but unfortunately, in some states, you get these little charter coupons, for lack of a better word, I don't know the exact word, where they give you these public-funded coupons that you can submit to a charter school to supposedly get a better education than you would if you went to a public school. But I won't say most, because there are some very well-run charter schools by private individuals. I think LeBron James just recently started a charter school. And of course, that probably will be very good because he comes from the area that he's teaching in and his mission is entirely good, or well-intentioned at least. But in other places, it's kind of more sinister than that. And there are, like I said, creationist schools that are charter schools and that teach like abstinence-only sex education and stuff like that, which I can't really get behind purely for the sole reason that it's funded by public dollars, which doesn't make sense to me. In the Constitution, it says separate church and state, right? And that's pretty much every modern Western democracy has that in their constitution, which is church and state are separate. And state dollars are not supposed to go to fund any religious institutions of any kind, right? That's why the government doesn't fund churches and stuff like that. Religious institutions are tax exempt, which I think is something that needs to be abolished, but that's something to talk about at a different time. But I don't think public dollars should be linked to schools that explicitly teach a religious curriculum. I don't think that's acceptable. That's just one point that I wanted to make. That's not really a major point. But there's always the fundamental problem with private and charter schools that they're even more exclusionary than public schools, right? Public schools are already exclusionary to a limited amount in that where you live governs what kind of education you get. But in private and charter schools, first of all, private schools can be very selective with who they take into their school. There's all these admissions exams sometimes you have to take, and sometimes you have to prove that you know somebody who's been to that school, or you have to prove that you have enough status to make it worthy for them to accept you into that school. And there's all these problems which are like very kind of ancient in the way that they work, and that's not something which I approve of, but I can't really say anything about it because it's a private institution. They can do what they want, but I don't think these policies are necessarily the best way to move forward in the current age. But even more than that, those are just the categories of educational institutions we have now, traditionally. Now, these educational institutions are based on the fundamental assumption that teaching a lot of kids in a small room is a good idea, which I don't think is a good idea. Like having 20 students in a classroom may not be a good idea for the maximum educational good of all those 20 students. This is like a leftover from the time of the one-room schoolhouse in like the prairie or like the pioneer days, when there would be one school teacher and 20 kids in a classroom because there were only 20 kids. and there was only one teacher. There's no reason to have it be this way now, other than it's a leftover, just like how we have summer vacation for no particular reason other than that. In the old days, farmers needed their kids back at their house to help with the harvest or whatever, or sowing the seeds or whatever. I don't know. The point is, it's farming related, and our economy isn't fundamentally farming based now, except in very small areas, so we don't need that to be a widespread accepted practice. So the problem with multi-student classrooms is that when you have 20 students in a classroom, not all of them learn at the same rate or in the same way. Now, this could be addressed if the classrooms are smaller and the teacher could pay more attention to certain students. If it was like 4 or 5 people in a classroom, for example, you can notice when a student isn't keeping up and then ask them directly, "Hi, are you having trouble with this? Can I help you in some way?" But when you have 20 students in a class, you're just shooting for the middle of the pack. You just want the middle of the pack to be able to keep pace, and that means those on the right-hand side of the bell curve will be bored, and those on the left-hand side of the bell curve won't have no idea what's going on. So you're losing a large proportion of your students just because you're aiming for the middle of the pack, just because multi-student classrooms are not a great idea. And even more than that, it's the subjects that are taught in schools are not original or new, or they don't tackle any of they don't address any of the technological innovation that's happened in the past 40 to 50 years. I'm going to go that far back. Yes, I think computers are used kind of as a gimmick now in classrooms, but they aren't incorporated in a grassroots level, like from the bottom up to just make learning faster. Like textbooks are still a thing. For some reason, I don't understand why textbooks are a thing. They're exorbitantly priced. They don't really contribute to anything. And I'm not talking about college textbooks. I'm talking about school textbooks, because the public school system does buy textbooks from the company, right? You could just buy one copy of an online ebook and then give it to every single student and save the taxpayer a lot of money. But you don't see stuff like that because, the textbooks are a big business and they don't want to lose any of their cut. Their number one customer is the U.S. public education system. So it doesn't make sense for them to do anything like that. And all the subjects that were taught in school, like math, chemistry, biology, are all just expansions of the original intent of school, which was to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to kids in the 1800s or whatever, when schooling became a thing for the poor. Before that, it was only a thing for the rich. They had a whole system, which I'll talk about later. But when they had this practice of teaching only the basics, when we moved across the years, it was expanded from the basics to incorporate more science topics, but there was no fundamental redefinition of what school needs to teach someone. Like public schooling, since it's provided to every single person, is a very useful way to distribute skills that we don't otherwise acquire through our lives. Like one of the cliches that it's passed around a lot is no one teaches financial literacy in classes, even though it's something that you need to know to be successful in life. So it ultimately comes down to your parents to teach this to you. Now this comes down to whether you value personal responsibility over governmental responsibility, right? And this was something that came up sort of as a controversy when the topic of teaching sex education in schools came up, because some people still don't believe that it's the duty of the school to teach kids sex education, but that it's the purview of the parents to do that. But the question at the end of the day is, do you want kids to know it or not? Because if you leave it to the parents, maybe most parents will. Maybe you can depend on most parents to teach their kids you can depend on most parents to teach their kids the things that they need to teach their kids for them to be successful, like how to use a credit card, like what the stock market is, like how to open a bank account, like how you should be saving every paycheck that you get, something like that. But if you leave it to the parents to teach their kids this, you take the risk that some kids won't learn this lesson. And it's up to you to decide how valuable these lessons are. For example, now in schools, there's a large push to teach kids how to code. But coding is not generally one of the things that you would expect kids to be taught at school. You expect parents to teach this to their kids because it's like an optional hobby. But schools have determined that it's so necessary for kids to know this that you might as well teach it at the public level, right? That's why we have fluoride in the water. It's to prevent people from getting rotting teeth. If you leave it to the people, maybe 90% of them will buy toothpaste and brush their teeth or whatever, and the other 10% won't. So you risk having 10% of the population just be horrible stink tooth people who get gingivitis and die. Like, you don't want that to be a thing. That's why we have the system that we have. But I think it needs to be expanded much further, to incorporate more things that are practically applicable to your life directly, instead of just teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and science. That's good. That's a good basis. And public schools are the best place to teach that, because I don't think higher education needs to be tailored toward that. But that's just one way to do it. You do need to teach other things other than these 4 things for it to be useful. And even more than that, there's the important question of whether we should have public schools in the first place, right? Because public schools are just a way to disseminate important information to the populace, to the kids, to teach them what they need to know. And the most effective way to do that universally is to have a government-implemented system. And some people will argue that, but I think it's been pretty well demonstrated how much literacy rates have gone up in the past century that it is an effective system. You can't argue that. Like, whether you argue the cost that it brings or whatever, you can't argue its efficacy, at least in terms of teaching the populace the basic skills that they need to, at least get a job. If not a good job, at least a job. If you pass high school, you will get a job, You won't be like begging on the streets or whatever. I don't know what the alternative is. I guess nowadays, even if you do pass high school, you don't get a job. But that was the initial goal with which they launched the system. So let's talk about another way you can disseminate information to the public, namely the internet. I don't know if you've been on the internet, but there's a lot of information on there, and most of it's free and all of it's easily available. You just have to know what to look for, right? So wouldn't the most cost-effective way to teach children be to disseminate it via the internet? For example, on YouTube, there are a couple of channels run by PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, which is funded by the government, and they do a great job at making educational videos. And some of the people which we all know and admire, like Lindsay Ellis, do make content for those channels. They teach all kinds of stuff. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard of Crash Course. Crash Course is in part funded by PBS. So that's a great way to disseminate information, and those videos have a fuck ton of views. You know why? Because people are interested in learning, whether they like to admit it or not. So there is a way to get information out. Now, I'm not going to say we should destroy the public funded education system. I just think in the new era, if you really care about your child's education, maybe, and you live in a place which is not that well off, maybe public school isn't the way to go. Maybe you should look more into homeschooling, because now is the best era to homeschool a child into my belief. Like, there are places like Khan Academy and other websites which are like tailored exclusively to teach kids, and they walk you through step by step everything you need to know about math, science, everything, right? And then since parents are teaching their kids, hopefully, they throw in the other more useful stuff in there too. So that's just the normal public education system, and I don't think there's a reason to completely demolish it. I think you can very easily opt out of it if you want. It's not necessary that you go. You can homeschool at any time you want. It's harder for the parent, but you know what? If you want to take responsibility for your child's education, it's going to require some time investment, I think, and I think that's a fair trade-off to not having to participate in the public education system. That's public education. Now, what about the big bogey in the room? The elephant in the room, higher education. There's only one thing to say about higher education. It's fucked, right? I don't think, first of all, higher education is non-standardized. That means there are massive inequalities between the way things are taught in bad schools and the way things are taught in good schools. At the end of the day, in public schools, the curriculum is the same over a state, over a county, whatever. There's still some level of standardization, so you can have some minimum bar for how good the education will be. But in colleges, there's no such thing. Now, there's all kinds of like scam colleges like FSU and University of Phoenix that kind of just exist to give people degrees for money, and there's not really any system to stop that. They are accredited by the National College Association or whatever. They are accredited, but it's like there's like a very low minimum for how much you need to do to get accreditation. And on the higher end, there's like this super upper echelon of places where there's like Nobel laureates working, and every other professor you meet has talk to the president on some advisory panel or something like that. Like, the upper level is super, super high. And the reason that this kind of dichotomy exists is because in the past, college was kind of a luxury for rich people, Like, in the early 1900s, not everyone went to college. Actually, a vast majority of the population didn't go to college, and that was acceptable at the time because not everyone needed a college education to get a reasonable wage. They just went to college if they, one, had the status to do so, two, were pursuing some kind of profession that required it, like doctor or something like that, or three, they just needed it for their status. Like, if you say that you don't have a college degree, people look down on you. An example I like to cite here is the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, got educated in England prior to India's independence. So that would be in like the early 1900s or the late 1800s. This guy was rich as fuck, okay? He went to school with the Queen of England, the current Queen of England. Just think about that. He went to college with the current Queen of England. So you can think about, and that was like Cambridge or Oxford, one of the big ones. So you can think about the level of prestige that these schools carried and still do carry to some extent, and the level of wealth that you needed to go to them. Now, that's kind of stayed the same. The level of wealth has not really decreased as much because the fees are still high as fuck. It's just that now, if you don't go to college, you're seen as lower. Like if you don't have a college degree, you're not taken seriously at many places. This is not the case so much in the computer science industry anymore. I think you just have to demonstrate that you have the necessary skills, and computer science is such a results-oriented industry that you can do that to some extent, but other places that may not necessarily be the case. So you still need a college degree to prove that you're a serious candidate and you should be considered for the job. So taking that into consideration, college is kind of deemed a necessity for a large proportion of the middle class population. Now the middle class is larger than ever. Now where you want to draw the line on middle class is kind of an arbitrary thing, but I would say now, or in the past, there was a large middle class, which is slowly decreasing now as the kind of stable employment that we've seen that led to that middle class is kind of going away to some extent, and the locked-in 30-year jobs at one place that you can provide for your family with don't really exist anymore, or if they do, they're not really handing them out to new people. So as these jobs go away and the middle class decreases, the importance for a college education is kind of like this lingering like vestigial trait that we still have, which I think will eventually taper off, but for now it's still high where our income is still low. And one of the reasons that the college tuition is so high is because government loans are so easy to come by. Now this is again kind of a libertarian slant for me, but it is one way to explain it. Now there are other reasons why it's so high. One of them is high demand, low supply. The campuses are only so big. There are a lot more people who want to get in than can, so it's important for the institutions to capitalize on the demand by keeping the price high. And they do hand out a lot of financial aid, but they do get money from the government to do so, at least at public universities. So I don't think that's very important to take into consideration. And I know some universities are need blind and they accept you, and then after you're accepted, they look at your financials. But by and large, the vast majority of people who get admitted can afford it, which means that there's a system that's incentivized to get as much money as possible out of the people that go there. Now, of course, the big bogeyman in the room when it comes to colleges is student debt, right? With all these sky-high education loans, like the interest rates on them, and top universities or any private universities charging $40,000 to $50,000 a year for an undergraduate education. A lot of students are coming out of college, undergraduate or postgraduate, with sky-high amounts of debt. Now, of course, this is a big problem, which I think would have resolved itself more if the loans weren't so easily available, but students don't really have any choice but to get the loans because they are so unaffordable up front. Like you can't just go and drop $40,000 a year for Princeton or whatever it is, even if you do get in, because who has that money? Like 50% of the US population don't have $500 in the bank. You just live paycheck to paycheck. That's what it is. So when you have all this money, when all this money is coming in to the universities, right? And the students can't even get rid of the debt, by the way. Student debt is the only debt that you can't erase through bankruptcy. So when all this money is coming in through the doors to the universities, what's the incentive? How do you keep pace? How do you make sure that the money keeps coming, right? Now, this is something that I've seen at my university, which I wouldn't say is like the tippy top of universities, but it is somewhere in the conversation up there, like among the recognized universities of the world. I go to UBC, and my friend who goes to UCSB also has had a similar experience. It's that so many students now are only looking for the prestige that the degree will bring them. So when they look at the prestige that the degree will bring them, what they look at is, of course, rankings. And there are many, many ranking websites that go around to universities to like arbitrarily decide which university is number 1, which one's number 9, or whatever it is. And when they do this, apparently, according to people who know these things, they say that the thing that they look at most is, one, the series, like how important your faculty are, and 2, infrastructure. Now, one, both things, by the way, can be solved with money. Number 1, you have to have the facilities to be impressive enough. For example, my university has a particle accelerator, a supercomputer, and like 35 huge ass buildings, which I don't even know what they have inside, but every year they're just nonstop building new things, right? And the experience of going to this university is complete ass, but they don't care because they're just trying to improve their rankings, because they know that they have to keep pace with every other university in the top 100 or top 200 or whatever. They're doing the same thing. They're getting just money thrown at them every year, because the graduates think that if they do that, they'll be able to recoup their investment by the prestige that the degree brings to them and the amount of salary they can increase, the amount of more salary they can get due to the prestige of the degree that they receive. So when they do this, the university kind of has to deliver on their part too. And their primary way of doing this is by building out unnecessary infrastructure. I say unnecessary because it's not directly of use to students. It's only directly of use to postgraduates or scientists who are working there, because that's part 2. Part 2 is how important and how often cited the faculty at your school are. So if you have a lot of faculty that are very accomplished in their field, even if they're not teaching the students, your university still gets ranked higher because it's affiliated with these important scientists. So the universities put out like this red carpet for very distinguished scientists, and they do their research there, but they're not involved in teaching at all, And I don't see why that has to increase the ranking of the university. It doesn't make any sense. So they put all this money into building. They just build, recklessly with no regard for the students at all. And at the end of the day, they're just doing it to keep pace with everyone else. It's like an arms race, like the university down the street, number 35, is building 6 new labs or whatever. That means me, university number 36, if I want to take their spot, I have to build 7 new labs. I have to keep pace. And because of the vast, the just monumentally large amount of money that's coming in, they're able to do this, and they're able to justify it by saying that, hey, we're improving our facilities to offer a better education, even though the vast majority of students never see any of this or never get to use any of it. And public universities have a even more sinister way of dealing with this. Private universities can arbitrarily increase their tuition, right? They just have to keep pace with demand and not put people off. And they're kind of I would say they know how much they can increase the rates by before the banks will be like, hey, you were charging 40K last year, you can't be charging 65K this year. That's not acceptable, The banks are the ones who have to pay for them. And even though student loan takers don't default all that much because their parents usually put up, if they don't, it's still a risk for the bank to take. So they don't want to put up all that money. So the university doesn't increase it astronomically. They also want to give the appearance of them being reasonable, so they don't just increase it 200% for no reason. But public universities aren't allowed to do that legally. They can only increase their tuition a max number of percent per year. Like here in British Columbia, UBC is only allowed to increase it a certain percentage points. So to make sure that the money keeps coming, they just increase the number of people that get admitted. And this has become such a problem now that you have undergraduate freshman classes increasing by like 10 to 12% year on year, which is nuts because the facilities are not there to accommodate all of them, and they're just coming in with no check for, like the basic requirements for going to a college. It's kind of sad at some point because I feel like a lot of them are either being underserved or just milked for their money in order to get a degree. But if that's what you want to do, then I guess it is possible to do that. And I don't consider this to be useful in any way, like a college degree is kind of a leftover remnant from the time when we needed that to be part of the middle class, but I don't think that's the case anymore. Even with the college degree, even with the master's degree, you're not guaranteed to get your place in the middle class, because the middle class, one, is waning, and two, the number of jobs just aren't there to sustain this large of a middle class. Now, that's what this all comes down to at the end of the day, is that college is kind of an outdated institution. It existed for a time to give workers to a system that needed it. It was based on some fundamental fallacies. Not everyone can be a doctor, doctorate. That's just the way the system works. You can't lead a lab by yourself. The system looks very open, but it is a pyramid. At the end of the day, there are only so many people who can be at the top. No matter how many doctorate students you churn out, there have to be jobs for them to be useful to have a doctorate at all, right? So the system was geared towards creating the most number of educated people as possible. And it has done that. But these educated people got into the system to reach an end. And the end was to get a good paying job. Now they've done one part. They've done their part of the bargain. But the other part isn't there. The demand isn't there for that kind of education. So what can you do? How do you fix this system? Well, first of all, how about, making it a non-gig economy? The gig economy is based on the institution having a large amount of power over the individual. And this is kind of the problem that we solved in the early 19th century when unions were invented, and unions spoke for the, unprivileged worker by forming a large group of them and protesting management's decisions, And now businesses are actively working to not have unions associated with them. Just off the top of my head, Tesla, no union. They don't really discourage unionization because why? That's illegal. But they don't encourage it either. Same for Amazon. Amazon doesn't have any unions, but they don't discourage their unions. They just don't encourage it either. If anyone makes any noises of unionization, I'm guessing they would be told not to do that, which I guess is illegal, which it is. And three, or Uber. Uber doesn't have any unions. There's recently been talk of the Uber drivers unionizing. But then we're back to square one with Uber, okay? There's a reason why decentralized labor platforms don't work. It's because the platform has a large amount of power over the single worker. And this is proven in the past to be an unsuccessful model, okay? Look back at the banana plantation workers in Colombia, right? Gabriel Garcia Marquez made this famous. When you make the worker completely without rights, generally that does not end well, okay? That's why we had unions in the first place. So that was kind of a tangent. But the point is, the gig economy does not favor worker rights, right? So at the end of the day, we end up with all these workers who have no place to go, and we have all these disenfranchised workers who are already in the industry, who are becoming less and less necessary. And the companies are not incentivized to hire more people because they're trying to make do with the number of people they have now, partially because the companies are expected to grow forever. There's no steady state. If you've studied physics, you know what a steady state solution is, where the system balances out and you just reach the place where you're going to be. There's no steady state in capitalism. You have to keep growing. So to do growth, you have to either reduce costs or increase profit, right? Increasing profit isn't as easy as it sounds. So the easiest way is to reduce costs, and one of the highest costs with any company is labor. So if you decrease labor costs, you automatically increase your profits, and you can show, hey, we grew 1-2% this year. I don't know how far this is going to be sustainable, and I think pretty soon, when a lot more things become automated, which I don't think is really soon, I think is in the midterm, maybe 20 years from now, when everything becomes automated, things will get a lot worse. Growth will be astronomical for some places for some time, and then it will stagnate very hard because you can't cut labor costs any more than robots. Robots is the floor of labor costs. It's a one-time investment and then free labor for life. It's kind of like slaves, but they're made of metal, so it's fine. So the point is, college is an outdated institution. If you're not going to do a job directly involved with the degree you're getting, don't go to college. That's all I can say. Now your parents might look at you and say, hey, what's up? And if you think you have to go to college, there are smarter ways to do it than just to go to a 4-year university. I know some people who do 2 years at a community college, transfer their credits, do 2 years at a 4-year university, get a 4-year university degree, right? You can do that. It's a lot less expensive. What I did was I applied to a bunch of universities, got into some, and I came to one that was relatively low cost. You can say a lot of things about UBC, but it's not very expensive, and I'm getting a college education for relatively cheap. I am taking loans out on it, so I'm not very happy about that, but I think I'll be able to pay them back because the government here recently made student loans interest-free if they came from the government, so there's that. I've got that going for me, which is nice. If you're at the age now where you're thinking about going to college, give it a second thought. Are you really going to do anything with that degree, and how much is it going to cost you? Because this is one of the reasons I think home ownership is going to go down with my generation, the 20-somethings now who are looking to buy a house in the coming years, is that when you start off your post-college life with 150K plus of debt, how are you possibly going to take on another 250,000 or 300,000 of debt to buy a house? Not to mention how, property prices are going up. That's a whole nother video. But the point is, if you're going to do it, give it serious thought. And if you don't think you need it, there are ways to get good jobs without it, okay? A lot of computer science people these days don't get degrees. There are ways to teach yourself online. And if you stay at home for 2 years learning how to do things, you can work on the side. You get money to learn. You're partially funding your own education without having to take on $100,000+ of debt. Just think about it before you jump in, because it is a deep pool and there are no lifeguards, okay? I think that's all I have to say, really. The internet is your friend. Okay, peace.